Okay, so welcome. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to be talking about our work that we did last year in Malta to identify priority knowledge needs to implement nature-based solutions in a Mediterranean context. And I'm going to be presenting the results of a workshop to identify these needs. And this was a collaborative work with our ReNature partners and also our stakeholders from the Mediterranean islands. Okay. So as we've heard, nature-based solutions are designed to address societal challenges. New definitions take further into account that they absolutely need to benefit the environment, which had previously been slightly ambiguous. They can also be actions inspired by nature. So we're getting a handle on what they imply. So nature-based solutions are a key EU environmental policy priority, shaping some of the research that goes on and more subtle policy directions. However, there's still a way to go in having nature-based solutions mainstreamed into policy and management, and uptake is pretty limited in general. So what causes this? One factor is we need to identify what the knowledge gaps are limiting implementation of nature-based solutions. And here we focus obviously on nature-based solutions in the Mediterranean islands. So what are these key knowledge gaps? How do we find them? So questions we thought about, which are critical, are how you can identify these knowledge gaps, implementing NBS in an inclusive way, which means involving a fair representation of all stakeholders who might be concerned. So for this, we devised a participatory process to synthesize stakeholder knowledge. And I'm going to talk now about knowledge synthesis. Knowledge synthesis is a systematic process to identify, collate, and prioritize the available evidence on a given issue. And we're going to think briefly about some of the methods of knowledge synthesis available. So knowledge synthesis can draw on scientific knowledge, which might be most familiar to people working in an academic context. But also, and this is important, it can be indigenous and local knowledge, and also tacit technical or opinion-based knowledge held by local stakeholders. So the goals of any knowledge synthesis process should be to conduct an inquiry that is systematic, comprehensive, inclusive of all stakeholders and representative of their particular opinions, limiting bias. And another way of thinking about methods of knowledge synthesis is to look at the policy cycle, much discussed, much debated, but possibly familiar to a number of you. And the policy cycle basically looks at the stages in designing and implementing a policy. So first of all, you have an agenda, which is basically the need for a policy. The policy is then formulated, then adopted, implemented, and then evaluated along the way. Actually, evaluation should happen at all stages of the policy cycle. And you can think about knowledge synthesis methods as being at particular stages of the policy cycle. So they can be exploratory, where they feed into agenda setting and formulation, analytical for formulation and adoption, and evaluation methods, which obviously feed into policy evaluation aspects. And we can think about the work that we did here as exploratory, really. And this picture, I should say, comes from a report by the Horizon 2020 Project Eclipse, which I'm also involved in. And I'll say a little bit more about that shortly. So what normally happens if one's conducting a knowledge synthesis? Generally, unfortunately, whoever's conducted synthesis is constrained by certain things, usually time and available resources. So a non-systematic literature review, which is something, again, that might be familiar to many scientists. It's basically you have a short window of time, you just hit Google Scholar, and you just collate as much information as you can as quickly as possible. There's not much evaluation, and the method you use to find the information you include is not really documented and not repeatable. So it's subject to a whole series of biases, which themselves are hard to quantify. Another thing that can happen, which is a slight improvement, is when you do something called vote counting, which means that you look at, say, 20 papers about an issue, you see what the evidence says about the issue, and you count basically how many papers are in favor of one particular standpoint on the issue and how many have the opposite view. And then you basically decide which has the majority. However, this is also prone to bias. It doesn't include the quality of the information that you're drawing on. And how do you choose those papers? It's not a great method. Another thing that happens a lot, and particularly in a policy context, is when you do something called expert consultation. And again, this might be most familiar to you as a process in which, for example, a minister calls up a scientist who he happens to know and says, "What do you think about this particular issue?" So say, for example, it might be green infrastructure. We're thinking about implementing a living wall. What do you know about it? And you can see where the problems come into play with that as well. It's very bias prone. It's not repeatable. So in the Eclipse project, we've written a report on 21 different methods of knowledge synthesis. And if you are interested in finding out quite a lot more about these methods, I would suggest you go have a look at the Eclipse website. And this link will probably be available to you when we distribute materials later on. So let's think a bit about how we can improve our knowledge synthesis processes, given the constraints that we're likely to face. As I said, we normally tend to go for certain methods because of the constraints, say non-systematic literature reviews and expert consultations. However, those do present a strong risk of bias, despite the fact that they don't require as much in terms of time and resources. So what we should be looking to do is to shift along the axis slightly, along the bias axis, towards methods that are slightly less biased and still don't require a lot of resources. So that would involve things like scoping review, in which it's again quite a quick review of the literature, but it's not as formal as, say, systematic literature review, which you see in the top left-hand corner of this graph. Systematic literature reviews are the gold standard of reviewing scientific published literature, and sometimes the grey literature. And they're very rigorous, but they require a lot of time and resources. So things like scoping review is a good compromise where methods are documented, but it's not such a formal evaluation of the quality of the evidence. Another method, which is relevant to participatory processes to draw on stakeholder knowledge, includes a multiple expert consultation with the Delphi process. And you can think of this as an analog to the expert consultation with a lower risk of bias. Again, it can be quite a fast process, but it's systematic and repeatable. And I'm going to present the results of a study that came out in 2011, which is really interesting. And it provides some of the rare evidence to back up what I just said about the importance of bias and how it can affect things. So the main finding of this study is that diverse expert groups using formal consensus methods have a lower risk of bias. And what does this study involve? The study involves a group of people who have varying statuses. So you can think of this as like a group of scientists who might involve a professor and a student and everyone in between. So on the x-axis, you have these people distributed by their perceived status. So Professor so-and-so would be around 8 or 9 on this axis, whereas students might be at the other end of the spectrum. And on the y-axis, we have, in relation to an issue that is the subject of the inquiry, the distance from the truth of people's perceptions. Slightly complicated thing to get one's head around. So what happened is that this group of people were asked to give their judgment about a particular issue, and there's a right answer, so they might be a certain distance from the truth. So this happened before group discussion and after the group discussion. So what was seen is that after the group discussion, people tended to move closer to the truth. And also, if we look at the high end of the axis, or the x-axis, so high status people, they tended to be quite far away from the truth. So as shown by a high value on the y-axis before the group discussion. But the group discussion was very effective in moving their opinions closer to the truth. So this really does show that formal consensus methods for participatory processes are the best way of achieving less biased results. It's a fascinating study. It also shows that qualifications, track record, and experience are not necessarily great guides to the performance of scientific experts. So our aim here is to think about how to find the knowledge gaps limiting implementation in limiting implementation of nature-based solutions in the Mediterranean islands. So what we did was we held a workshop to develop a collaborative stakeholder-led set of priority knowledge needs. And this happened in Malta in May last year. So we were able to convene a group of 18 environmental stakeholders from different aspects of local and national government, NGOs, different kinds of business, and of course, research on environmental areas. Our stakeholders came mainly from Malta, but also from Cyprus and Sardinia. And we carried out a modified Delphi process to identify these priority knowledge needs. And the modification in this Delphi process comes from the inclusion of a face-to-face workshop, which is what we carried out. The Delphi process is a method of participatory knowledge synthesis for stakeholders. One key thing to note here is that participants provide information anonymously initially. There's a discussion, then people can revise their opinions. And this approach of anonymity in providing the information allows limiting biases. There's a group discussion to exchange information, so you have, as described earlier, opinions before and after. Participants update their information again anonymously. And one key reference for this method, should you wish to read up on it a bit, is Sutherland et al. 2018. It's been used in a number of different scenarios in environmental contexts. So I'm going to take us step by step through what happened here. First of all, we identified and invited our group of environmental stakeholders, attempting to cover people who were relevant for all aspects of the environment in the Mediterranean islands. Stakeholders were first asked to submit between 3 and 5 knowledge needs anonymously online, and we received 71 of these needs. The stakeholders then were given the entire list of knowledge needs submitted by everyone and asked to vote individually for each of their top 10 most important knowledge needs. And we defined important here as likely to make a change in the implementation of nature-based solutions in the stakeholders' institutions. Then the stakeholders were brought together in a face-to-face workshop to discuss the knowledge needs. Knowledge needs that were not at all scored, that were not at all prioritized, were generally not discussed. However, if stakeholders requested it, they could be brought back into the discussion and scoring process. The stakeholders assigned the knowledge needs a score based on this importance, and between 0 and 1,000, where 1,000 is the most important and 0 the least. And then for each of the knowledge needs that were scored, we obtained the median score rank. And I'm just going to show you these knowledge needs. Okay, so the top knowledge need was the need for a more precise definition, what exactly nature-based solutions are. And the second one was identifying which nature-based solutions are adapted to dry Mediterranean conditions to minimize irrigation needs, which is understandably an increasingly pressing issue with climate change. Third, how to increase the adoption and actual use of nature-based solutions in urban plans. And fourth, how can your existing buildings and built-up areas be modified to accommodate green infrastructure? And fifth was the requirement for a cost-benefit analysis of urban green spaces to identify what the long-term benefits are to human health and society versus the opportunity costs of not developing that land, which is an increasingly pressing issue given ever higher population density and land prices in the Mediterranean islands. And you'll notice that each of these knowledge needs was assigned a particular category. And categories included nature-based solutions options, implementation, capacity and policy levers, and cost benefit. There was also societal engagement. And as we see here, these categories distributed fairly evenly in the rankings. So you have here the rank on the x-axis, and the top knowledge need is the one with the lowest median rank, and the colors represent the different categories, and we don't see that particular categories were particularly systematic in the way they fell out. Further, we identified what these, sorry, just a moment, switch back. Sorry about that. There we are. Yeah, so we identified these, we categorized these knowledge needs as what the next steps would be to address them. And the majority of them required next steps of additional knowledge syntheses and or primary research. And a number of them were also ready to start taking action for implementing at the level of policy and business. So we carried out this knowledge synthesis process as a first step in deciding what research priorities are for nature-based solutions. So it was encouraging to realize that lots of these do actually require knowledge synthesis and or research as the next steps. The ones that are ready for policy and business action highlight where we can develop partnerships with industry to take this forward. I'm just going to the next slide, yes. So another thing to mention is that we carried out various statistical tests to see if we can say a little bit more about the level of consensus. And these were the Friedman test and the Wilcoxon signed rank tests. And what we found is that there was little group agreement or consensus on what these priority knowledge needs are. Of course, we see variations in the ranking, but fundamentally what these tests tell us is that our stakeholders have very diverse perspectives on this, which is understandable and to be expected. So the Friedman test is used to compare group means, where you have the same group of participants, but they receive different treatments. And in this case, our treatments are the questions. And the dependent variables are ordinal, which means different kinds of categories, semi-categorical variables. So this is for one group that's measured on 3 or more different occasions. Now it's a non-parametric version of the ANOVA, one-way ANOVA with repeated measurements or questions. The Friedman test does not tell you which groups are different, as in our case, whether the rankings of each knowledge need are different. Well, which of those rankings are different from each other, only that some might be. So to identify which are different, one needs to carry out the Wilcoxon signed rank test, which is a non-parametric equivalent of the dependent or paired sample t-test. And that means we have to compare each ranking, the ranking of each knowledge need sequentially. So because we're doing so many comparisons, we need to perform an additional correction for repeated measures. And those tests, as I said, tell us that statistically we can't really say that these rankings are dramatically different. Although I will note again that what I present here are the rankings that have been through this process of submission by participants and then scoring. So they are considered to be very important needs. It's just that discriminating between these top knowledge needs is difficult. Yeah, next steps will be either knowledge synthesis or further primary research. And a motif that came out constantly was that stakeholders would love to see evidence of effectiveness of nature-based solutions, such as cost-benefit analyses, and also nature-based solutions that are tailored to the local contexts. There's a lot of information available on nature-based solutions, but practitioners and managers repeatedly told us that it's great that it's there, but when it comes to implementing things practically, people need to know that it's going to work and that it's the best alternative to use, and they need evidence of that. And evidence of this is kind of still lacking in a Mediterranean context in particular. And this is where the compendium comes in, and where it allows us to highlight what the lacks are in the Mediterranean and to compare to other scenarios in different countries where things might be further along in the implementation process. So the results of this workshop have been written up as a paper which is currently under revision for environmental science and policy. And all our stakeholder participants are co-authors on the paper, which is great. You should be getting results on that soon. And what are the next steps for this? Well, we've decided that our next step is to conduct a collaborative in-depth knowledge synthesis to understand what the obstacles are to implementing nature-based solutions in Mediterranean urban plans. So of the knowledge syntheses, of the priority knowledge needs that emerge as a result of this workshop, this is one that allows us to conduct another participatory process. There's a great lack of information available on this in the literature. We also have expertise within the ReNature collaboration, which is great, in the form of University of Trento and Trinity. So we're optimistic about this. Whereas, for example, although it's still an issue, the knowledge need of a better definition for nature-based solutions, that's been a rapidly developing area in the last few months. And things have clarified, as Mario mentioned, with the updated definition. So we're also aware of how important it would be to conduct pilot research projects with industry partners to allow us to monitor the benefits of nature-based solutions. And this would also have the effect of increasing public awareness. And options for this include conducting focus group studies on the effects of implementing nature-based solutions. And we already have some interest from industry partners in Malta. And as well, continuing to collate examples of best practice through the Mediterranean in the form of the NBS compendium. And that brings me to the end, and thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you, Miriam. Unless there are questions which we would like us to consider now, I think we can move on to the presentation by Davide. After Davide's presentation, we will have time to discuss the different aspects mentioned. There were some questions which have been answered directly. For example, I have seen by Marcos. There are some interesting links to interesting studies and actions going on. So maybe we can mention these at the end after Davide's presentation, where we have some time dedicated just for that. Okay, Davide, you have the floor now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mario. Good morning and good afternoon. So we have heard in previous talks about the many potential benefits and co-benefits of nature-based solutions in cities. Things like green walls and green roofs, parks of different types and size, street trees, and so on. I would like to discuss some ideas about how to mainstream nature-based solutions in one of the key instruments that actually shape cities, that is urban plans. This is actually an objective that has been recently put forward by the new EU biodiversity strategy, which was released just last month, and that, among many other ambitious objectives, explicitly calls for the systematic integration of nature-based solutions into urban planning. We have been working on something very similar for the last couple of years through a project jointly with the municipality of Trento, which is the city where my university is based. And the idea was to try to use as much as possible ecosystem service knowledge to develop to mainstream nature-based solutions into the new urban plan of the city. We develop an approach that belongs to the family of performance-based planning approaches. So I'm quickly describe what I mean by performance-based planning, and then I will provide an overview of the key elements of our approach. Simplifying, we can identify two main approaches to planning. Let's say to endpoint of a spectrum. Most plans actually belong somewhere in between. So most plans are actually a hybrid of these two approaches. But these approaches are, on the one hand, prescriptive planning, and on the other hand, performance-based planning. So in prescriptive planning, basically your plan will develop, for example, a rigid zoning scheme, which means subdividing the urban space into different units, and then associate to each unit specific possible functions, possible land use conversions, with detailed development rights and regulations. That means that once the plan is completed, then developers can propose development, land use changes, urban transformations, and the authority will basically check whether those proposals comply with the regulations that have been set for that specific location. And according to the compliance, they will release the authorization or not. So the plan is highly rule-based, not flexible at all, and quite predictable in terms of the future outcomes, even though it might be less so in case the regulations are complex or not clear. So that's one approach. And on the other end of the spectrum, again, we have performance-based approaches, where the idea for the plan is to identify more general strategies, goals for the future, for the long term, and then identify a number of requirements, a number of quality standards that future urban transformations have to meet without detailing exactly where something can or cannot happen. So the idea is that when developers make a proposal, then the authority, the administration will perform an impact assessment of that proposal to figure out whether it meets the overall plan objective. So whether that proposals, when implemented, will contribute to develop the cities in a direction that was foreseen by our long-term goals and strategies. So in this respect, plans are much more flexible, more strategic, but also much more complex to manage. So there is a lot of interaction, a lot of dialogue, a lot of negotiations between developers and the authorities, which required, let's say, more and more efforts from the planning authority in terms of data availability, but also capability to run models, to run impact analysis, and so on. So again, we have these two ends of the spectrum, and in between a number of hybrid situations. The interesting element of performance-based planning is that it has been used mainly to introduce environmental standards, to increase the environmental quality of urban environments by introducing regulations, quality requirements based, for example, on the amount of soil sealing, the amount of green areas introduced by development. So we've been seeing that quite a lot, both in countries like Australia, the US, but also in Europe. For example, quite a recent example of a performance-based approach was developed a few years ago in Oslo, was applied in Oslo. I'm not sure whether it was also applied in other places in Norway. And it's called the green-blue factor. And the idea is that the authority analyzed a proposed development by looking at all the elements that you see in this table. So the amount of permeable surface that will exist after development or that will be created by the development, the amount of vegetation, but also soil thickness, the tree canopy, the presence of natural edges, and so on. And all those elements concur to produce an overall score. And the idea is that if the old development achieves a given threshold, then it can be approved, else it cannot. Well, I simplified a bit, but that's the general idea of performance-based approach. So you propose a project, the project is tested, its impact is predicted, and then if the outcomes are positive, it can go on. So we built on this general idea and developed the principles of a performance-based approach, highly rooted on information about ecosystem services. So we want ecosystem service, supply and demand, to become the key to regulate to determine what kind of developments can happen in different locations of the city. Particularly, we look both at ecosystem service supply and demand in the city. And here you can see the general conceptual approach that we developed. The idea is that we have an analytical component here, so the knowledge basis that is created before the plan is approved, that consists in understanding, analyzing the current ecosystem service supply. So the ecosystem services that are currently supplied by urban ecosystems in our city. And this element is used to figure out the impact of proposed developments on that supply. And according to the magnitude of that impact, then the development will have to achieve a more or less high level of performance in terms of future nature-based solutions that have to be associated to development. But we also look at the demand. That means that according to a specific location where the transformation is proposed, the development is proposed, there might be a different demand from population for specific ecosystem services. So for example, there might be a demand for microclimate regulation if it is an area that is particularly exposed to heat waves. And that means that in our assessment, we assign priorities to that specific service. Hence, we required our performance, our future nature-based solutions to specifically target that demand. So the development can be approved only if the associated MBS do something, do a job in terms of reducing, for example, heat island effect, reducing temperature. So I'm going to expand now a little bit about these two elements, and then I'm going to exemplify how the results can be applied to guide future developments and identify required nature-based solutions. Let's start with the top one, the supply. I would say this is somehow standard mapping and assessing, ecosystem service mapping and assessing exercise. So we selected a number of priority ecosystem services jointly with the decision makers involved in the planning process. And then we identify suitable indicators to represent those services and map those services. And then we apply methods to produce a mapping with a suitable spatial array solution. In some cases, these are kind of standard methods. You can find them in the literature. In other cases, they were tailored or developed from scratch in order to meet the specific needs and characteristics of our local context. And you can see here the relevant publications. Again, the idea for this exercise was to produce an outcome that could be used to understand the impact of future developments on the current ecosystem service supply, hence figuring out appropriate, let's say, compensation offsets that the development will need to provide in the form of nature-based solutions. The outcomes of this analysis are, well, a set of maps. You can see here the individual ecosystem service map for the municipality, and here the combined map where the results have been aggregated, and this is used to figure out the overall supply of ecosystem services in different parts of town. Particularly, the red areas are the most important in terms of supply. So that means that development occurring in that area will have to come with a lot of, let's say, compensation measures in the form of nature-based solutions. The other element, and perhaps the most innovative of our proposal, considering that supplies are being included, ecosystem service supply analysis are being included more and more often in urban plans, is a specific analysis of demand. That means that for the selected services, we try to look at how demand changes across the city, across different neighborhoods, but across different spatial units. For example, the first service I see here, microclimate regulation, we first map different classes of cooling effect, so different intensity of potential heat waves, and also map the presence of people exposed to those heat waves in terms of the number of people, but also their vulnerability by considering, for example, age groups. And by combining the two, we had an idea of where that service is particularly on demand in the city. And considering that the cooling effect is something that occurs really in a very limited space, so you have to be very close to green space in order to benefit from that effect, the benefiting areas is quite small, as you see here, roughly 100 meters. And then we did the same for the other services by changing, of course, the way in which the intensity of the hazard was measured, and also by changing the way in which the indicators used to represent exposure and vulnerability, and also changing the benefiting areas. So for example, in the case of noise mitigation, then we look at areas exposed to noise from roads and railroads, but also areas where we have a particularly high concentration of residential buildings. And then we figure it out as benefiting areas, the space in between, because of course your green space needs to be located in between residential buildings and the source of noise. So that is the area that could benefit from nature-based solutions aimed at reducing noise. And similar approaches for the other services. So also in this case, the outcome was a map of ecosystem service demand across the city. Here you see on the left-hand side, you see the individual demand, so demand for the individual services, and then the combination. But in this case, the combination was obtained by clustering different types of demand. And to keep things relatively simple, we identified only a limited number of clusters, 6 you see here. So clusters represent areas of the city characterized by the same demand for specific ecosystem services. So for example, the light blue area here is an area where the demand is mainly for runoff mitigation kind of services, whereas the red area here represent a cluster where the demand is for ecosystem services associated to recreation and food production, and so on. So clusters represent areas characterized by the same kind of ecosystem service demand. And of course, given that we need to simplify the clustering, some approximation was introduced here not to produce too many different clusters, but it will give an idea of how demand for different services change across different neighborhoods. And just for giving you a better understanding of the map, the gray area is largely a woodland. The city is in a pine valley, so the valley floor is where we have most urban areas, and both slopes, the slopes on both sides are mostly covered by woods. So now the two outputs, so the overall supply map and the overall demand map, was used to guide basically the required performance for future interventions, and particularly the ecosystem service supply is used to understand how much performance should be produced by the new nature-based solution, so the level of performance. The higher the impact on the supply, the higher the performance that we expect to be associated to the intervention. Whereas the demand, which again is perhaps the most innovative elements of the approach, is used to identify the type of performance. So whether we need NBS targeted at reducing noise, or reducing temperature, or increasing accessibility to recreational space, or to, for example, urban agriculture spaces, and so on. So the combination of the two allows us to identify the specific requirements to the performance that is to be associated to the proposed urban interventions in order to be approved. To make things operational, actually, a scoring system is needed, but I'm not going to go into those details. I just, let's say, try to give you the overall idea. And here you see an example. So this is a sector of the city. We look at the existing plans to understand areas that are planned to be further developed. And particularly these two polygons here, A and B, represent possible infill development. So possible future residential development in areas already pretty much urbanized. If we overlay these two polygons to the ecosystem service supply map, one is about here and the other here, we see that they occur on areas with different ecosystem service supply. To make things simple, I would say a medium supply in the case of A and a high supply in the case of B. So B produce a higher impact means that the nature-based solutions will have to be more intense. By intense, I mean either bigger or more effective in providing the required services. So this will tell us the how much. And by overlaying the proposals to the demand, we have an answer to the question, what do we need? What is the target of nature-based solutions? In this case, the target is mainly interventions that enable to contribute to food supply, recreation, and microclimate regulation. So that means that the nature-based solution that can be designed along with the proposed development will have to do something for these three specific objectives. For example, they can be a combination of a small community garden and a recreational area, but designed in a way that it can provide cooling. And you know that according to the density of trees, the size of trees, the distribution of different surfaces, the cooling effect will change. So what we want to make sure is that the design elements of this new proposed green space will fit the purpose of contributing to microclimate regulation, because this is what we need in that area. Second example, in this case, again, another possible land use transformations foreseen by the plan. In this case, a larger, slightly larger development at the edge of the city. The development is planned in an area where the ecosystem service supply is pretty high. So again, it will have to do a lot in terms of compensation, and where the demand actually changes. So we have an area here, the cluster purple, the purple cluster, where the demand is mainly for noise reduction. And here we have a combination of other needs, such as, for example, runoff mitigation and so on. So that means that the design, the future nature-based solutions will have to be consistent with those needs. For example, by foreseeing some measure to reduce noise here, and here I'm just putting some picture to give you an idea of what I mean. So intervention like this one to shield the residential areas from noise, or intervention like this one to contribute to runoff, to reduce runoff, so to mitigate runoff. Of course, the scale will be different than the one depicted in this picture, something much smaller, but it will give you an idea of the kind of rationale that is guiding the whole process. Some concluding discussion points. So what we develop is basically what we call a proof of concept. In order to, so it's a technical policy document that, in order to be made operational, requires a lot of interaction with policymakers and with the whole set of actors involved in the planning processes, because there are many details that are not technical at all. For example, we simply sum up ecosystem services, but we could decide that they should be weighted according to their importance. So that's a topic that could be discussed during plan making. to decide, for example, that some service is more important than other. The same applies to the issue of trade-off. Shall we allow any sort of trade-off between services, or shall we decide that there are services that cannot be traded off with other services? Again, something that has to be decided by the actors involved in the planning process, both from the political component and the whole range of stakeholders that should be consulted. Another issue that needs to be decided to make this operational is the level of complexity, because while we can make it pretty much as complex as we want, considering that we have quite high resolution data, but ultimately some simplification will be needed, for example, in the way in which the services has been classified in order to simplify the management. Administration can also decide whether they want this to be an open tool, fully transparent, fully accessible, so that developers can get an idea of what is needed in a specific areas even before putting forward a proposal, or can decide that only part of it can be shared, perhaps because it's too complex to be communicated. So all typical classical issues that need to be discussed and decided upon during our planning process. Our main idea was to develop ways to expand the use of ecosystem service knowledge in urban planning, which we believe is an important niche to be developed. And I think that, again, the main contribution is to combining both the demand and supply, and also to paving the way, or anyway, giving an idea of how a path that could be used to promote a systematic integration of nature-based solutions in city planning. I conclude by quickly referencing to the papers that is open access and contain the main concept that I just described, and also a book, also open access, that provide a bit of a broader framework within which this research was initiated. And finally, I conclude with an actually a quick advertisement. If you're interested in working on similar topics, there is currently a call open for a fully funded PhD fellowships. Deadline next month, so please email me in case you're interested in doing research in this field. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Davide. I think now we have the opportunity to discuss further, for further questions, especially for the last two speakers, that is Davide and Miriam. We don't have at the moment any unanswered question and answers. I see some. Okay. So we can open the floor. I mean, so something which I consider as being very important is the availability of indicator data, the availability of data that can be used to monitor and also to assess where an MBS can be beneficial or not, and useful. And that is something I think that has been treated by probably most of the speakers today. In our cycle, which we were presenting before, in my opinion, there is an opportunity first to assess where to implement certain nature-based solutions based on what is lacking, as I was also mentioning earlier on, and as very well presented by Davide just now, and also then to monitor the impact of nature-based solutions in terms of how well do they solve these societal challenges. So that's what we are trying to do, and bringing all of these different aspects together in ReNature. That's what we are doing, bringing all these things together in the sort of cycle where we're building capacity to do these things and working with our stakeholders in Malta and other places as well to create the evidence that can be then used for decision making. I have seen some questions earlier on in the question and answer section. And now is also the time to ask other questions, to discuss further, to provide us with your feedback. So if there's anything that you would like us to discuss, to mention, to provide your feedback, now is the time to do so. I have some feedback from Ty, and he's saying how well the presentation by Davide was, but of course, if there's some point for discussion, That's also very much appreciated, Tig and all the other participants. We will be putting all of the presentations on YouTube. They are already there right now, including the technical glitch we had earlier on. So everything is online. So if anyone is interested in the presentations, they are already online. But we can, of course, you can email us or ReNature or the speakers, and you can ask for presentations too, I guess. Okay, so maybe Miriam, we can say just a few words about the next steps for the knowledge needs. So now we have done the knowledge needs assessment. We have a paper which probably should be published soon. And the next step is actually to carry out a knowledge synthesis. And there has been some discussion in the consortium about the next step. So maybe we can. This is an opportunity to sort of even just say a few words about it. It's not in detail, but we are now in the second half of the project, and we have in the next few months we plan to carry out a knowledge synthesis with our practitioners, especially focusing on urban environments and nature-based solutions.
Yeah. So we decided on that knowledge need as one of the top knowledge needs that is quite broad and comprehensive, and it has immediate practical value. Excuse me, all of which makes it an excellent candidate for the next knowledge synthesis approach. And so we're going to be drawing on a lot of the planning expertise within the consortium to identify the key stakeholders at each stage of the planning process. Again, focusing on Malta, which has the advantage of being quite a small system in which it's easy to identify the key players, and there's already a well-developed network that we have, but also potentially throughout the Mediterranean islands. And we're going to be conducting a similar sort of process, so a modified Delphi process, largely online, likely, given the current coronavirus constraints, but we'll see. So it'll start by, excuse me, asking the stakeholders to identify what they perceive as the main barriers. And then there's going to be opportunities for them to discuss these. And then to, again state what their opinions are. And those opinions might have changed as a result of the group discussion. So that will allow us to identify what those barriers are. And the challenge with this sort of thing is to not be too general and to not focus on, well, what are of course the constraints of various political contexts, but to focus on problems that can be overcome.
Okay, so just to recap, I think this was really one of the biggest one of the biggest knowledge gaps that we have. How do you integrate nature-based solutions in urban planning? And I think we've treated that topic today also by David's presentation and also Marco's presentation. We're discussing different type of nature-based solutions. And we have the opportunity actually to test some of these approaches also with Davide, for example, here in Malta, where we're looking at performance-based planning approaches that can be used for the case study areas that I have shown before. It's still early stages, but this is sort of something we will develop in the next 1 year or so, and that is until the end of the project. Marcus, I don't know if you would like to.
I see two questions in the Q&A box. I can take the first one. So it's a question from George. It's a very interesting point he made about whether we should also include more specifically social needs in our demand for solutions. And I thank you very much for this question. I think it's a great point. We have actually debated quite a lot earlier on in our project. At the end, the only social needs that was included were the two social needs that were included were the one for self-production of food and the one for recreation, which I guess you can still consider as a social need. All the other ones are more related to the environmental realm. And the main reason for that is that we did not have socioeconomic data with spatial resolution that would enable us to make in, let's say, suitable spatial differentiation. But I think that for perhaps for broader, larger urban areas, our city is quite small, where you can easily differentiate by neighborhood, for example, then the interaction of other social variables will be extremely interesting and actually be a must, I would say, for the design and planning of future nature-based solutions.
Davide, can I say something? Sorry, that's Miriam as well.
No, go,
Yeah,
go
go ahead.
ahead. No,
Okay.
well, you go ahead. Yeah.
So basically for George, we've done something like this for Malta, where basically we have assessed ecosystem services and then looked at any differences there are for when you consider different socio-economic conditions. And this is the same paper I was mentioning before. So we looked at the socio-economic dimension, and our paper just does indicate that there could be some trends even here locally. So we work in the same study areas. That's why I say here. And yes, so I think, and in our case, we considered distance to spaces offering regulating ecosystem services and also cultural ecosystem services. It's the same data set that I was discussing before, but it's another step where we looked at the socio-economic aspect and there are differences in terms of ecosystem services. Flows to these different social groups, let's put it like this. Okay, Miriam, that's my point.
Yeah, it was basically that point. It is a critical aspect if one really practically wants to see greater mainstreaming of NBS, because whether that's assessed in a systematic way or not, it does enter into the planning equation at some point. There's no doubt about it.
Davide, would you like to take the second question?
There's a second question by Marcio.
Yes.
To me and also everyone. I can start with it. So the question is whether what we can do in dense urban environments like Malta, where there's not much space for implementing nature-based solutions. Well, I have three things to say about that. The first one is that not all NBS requires space on the ground. So I think Marcus gave some nice examples, and also Mario, you discussed NBS that in principle do not require new space because they can be built on top of buildings or on top of existing structures. First thing, so one obvious answer would be to start looking at those possibilities. Second answer is to consider urban regeneration, which is huge in many countries in Europe, where actually most of the urban transformation processes are not the development of new urban space, but rather the redevelopment of existing urban space. And by doing that, you could actually redesign the development by making sure that enough room is left for nature-based solutions, for example, by densifying buildings and so on. And the third consideration is that also areas with limited, also in areas where the space is limited, you can get interesting results by considering the cumulative effects of NBS. So the effects of many small patches of, for example, green space in terms of cooling and in terms of runoff mitigation. Although I agree that those effects are relatively understudied, so it's not easy to work out appropriate models, but I think we saw some example of those models for cooling in our training course in Trento last February. So there is space for taking advantage of the cumulative effects of many small NBS. Thank you for this very relevant question.
I was going to say the same. One of the things that we see also is that rather like social learning or social experience, people who see nature-based solutions regularly, it becomes a normal thing. So the example I always give is 10, 15 years ago, nobody had a solar panel on their roof. And when you try to get one, I know I did in my own house, I had to import it from another country. Now you can buy them you can buy solar panels in a shop anywhere. So that's 10 years, maybe 12 years where people saw them and then they experienced them, that they worked, and then they demanded, and then they became more regular, and then they became more commonplace. So nature-based solution is something similar, that right now we've got little models or examples in places where we can put them. But we now need to be thinking about, just as David was saying, where we think we can't put them. It's, the streets are so small, or the streets are, you know, the pavement is too hard, or there's very important archaeology below the ground, or the soil is too toxic, or whatever. So there is the opportunity here for designers and planners and companies to really come up with innovative ways of doing these, and that gives them the market for that. And then by doing so, it becomes something we see every day. And when we see it every day, it becomes something that we don't want to not see. You know, it's when you have a park nearby, you suddenly notice when it's closed, and you know, may not walk in the park every day, but you may notice when it's closed. So it's important to see it every day, and I think that's where we can get a lot of community buy-in. And the other aspect of when we're doing urban regeneration, already we have planning regulations and so on about quality of life, noise, well-being, health, water quality, etc. It just needs to be part of that process. It needs to be built into that part of that process. So when we have the evidence that shows that stress levels and noise levels, etc., are maintained by a variety of solutions, including nature-based solutions, gradually the things will change. So unfortunately it's a slow process, but when the process moves, people start to want to have more things in their environment that actually is nature-based as time goes on. And once we're able to show them that it is affordable and it is a unique thing, that it doesn't have to be a very specially brought in, specially made thing. You can actually purchase and do it yourself, in fact. Then we will start to see nature-based solutions more mainstream, and people will come up with ideas. It's not a complete problem solver, because some people might do inappropriate development still. Some nature can be inappropriate in some places, even with the best will of the world. So there's still going to be potential discussion topics around when you put a nature-based solution to a location. But like David was saying, I think it is part of our way of building cities, that when we renew and redevelop and retrofit older buildings, this is the opportunity to put in a nature-based approach.
Maybe I can say something about dense urban environments. So our research is actually in Malta, and when we do the ecosystem and service assessment that we were discussing just now, we realized that in such a dense urban space, there's of course not a lot of space for nature, for places where we provide you with these services, but there are a lot of fragmented urban ecosystems, so very fragmented, very small urban ecosystems, which on their own, so we're talking about, for example, private gardens, which we often do not consider in our discussion, which on their own are not, so one garden on its own is not very important, but when you put all of this together, for example, in one entire urban agglomeration, you realize that they become very important. And even in terms of structure, for example, we've noticed that the structure of these private gardens is very different from public gardens, for example, and they provide already a lot of benefits. So if we are losing that because of the rapid urbanization, then we also need to think about nature-based solutions that can function in this very limited space. And I think there we need to think about maybe green walls and green roofs, which are more effective at providing services and not being an impact. I saw a discussion, for example, about water, and that is a crucial one, I think, for Mediterranean environments. So that becomes very important. But as David and Marcus were saying, it's also this urban regeneration projects. It's not just about putting some green in these open spaces. It's what type of green, and unlike it's not the first time I saw it, but the case of the square or the platform mentioned by Marcus, where you have all these different flowering plants and so on. So the question is, what type of green do you put in there? What type of nature do you put in there? How effective are they? And I think we need measurements for those. To answer your question, Marcio, I mean, It's not just about putting some nature-based solutions, but we need to understand exactly how important they are, how good they are in providing these services and these benefits. I don't think there's a lot of data about that, in my opinion.
No, I mean, I'll just add that the information we were getting from our stakeholders is they really would appreciate seeing more evidence through monitoring, cost-benefit analyses,
Yeah.
coupled with pilot projects to demonstrate what the effects are and to allow us to carry out this monitoring in the first place.
Yes, and in fact, this is the thought also behind the compendium, for example. Basically, our stakeholders, so some of whom are here with us today, so please feel free to chip in and put in your thoughts about this, saying we need to have a showcase of good examples. So what is working and when and how, what are the benefits? So for example, Miriam mentioned cost benefit analysis. There's not a lot of data about this. I mean, that do the benefits outweigh the costs? And of course, that's something for that requires data about the services and the values that arise from these nature-based solutions. I think we can take the next. Yes, Davide?
Just to add a very, very quick thing to Marcio's question, that we were talking about private gardens, buildings, possible ways to incorporate net-based solution, for example, in building retrofitting. But for example, in Malta, in this very urbanized area, is also full of public spaces, if we think about it. A lot of streets, a lot of squares, and also these need to be designed to accommodate net-based solution. Why not? And then they complement net-based solution in private areas. So there are, yes, different ways to push for the uptake of net-based solution. We are just to think about if we are doing this in a private land or in public projects, or yes, like public streets. There are a lot of pedestrian streets where you can put, for example, trees and other kind of nature-based solution.
Yeah, I guess it depends. In the urban cores, there may not be a lot of place to put in street trees, for example, because we're talking about relatively small roads, which are where parking could be competing with for the space, for example, or cars could be competing for the space. But for example, we've mentioned COVID before, and right now there are new measures being rolled out really about how to make these squares more available to the public, how to ensure more people are walking to the urban centers and so on. And these are, of course, very positive measures. But I think it's how you do it. It's more about the type of nature you put in there. I mean, it's fine to put in some greening and embellishment, but and maybe make it more available to the public in terms of for recreation. But how about surface water management? So you need to integrate different benefits. So making nature or the nature-based solutions multifunctional. Rather, just we often start from one thought, right? Making the square or the place more accessible to the public. But I think now is the time also to think about the wider benefits. Otherwise, we really are risking and losing most of these potential benefits which are there. Because if you're redoing a square, that is the good time to think about the social aspects mentioned by George earlier on, to think about urban surface water and urban drainage systems, SUDs, to think about the type of green infrastructure you want to put in there to remove air pollution, and so on. So I think we need data for these things, and it's not available at the moment. Can we move on to the next question by Taig? So could private gardens add to natural soundscapes and other benefits, even if most urban citizens don't see them?
What is interesting is that if you combined all the private gardens in the United Kingdom, you have an area of land that's larger than all the national parks put together. And the same statistic is in Ireland too. They're the only two I know of. know of. And I think it's pretty much a global thing that there's more land given over to private gardens than there is for nature reserves in general, with the exception of very large nature reserves, obviously. So there's private gardens are an enormous opportunity, but what people do in their private gardens, the word private is the key word. It's not legislative or anything we can force people to do. And unfortunately, people sometimes choose to pave over their gardens for parking cars, and we get something like a statistic in London that 1/4 of private front gardens are now paved over. So it can actually, that increases not only the lack of permeability and damaging the soil, but also, of course, noise goes up and heat is retained. So there's a role here for the planning authorities and the legislative authorities in terms of what is permissible in public. For example, you can't have parties and things like that in gardens because it's a law. So this could be covered, but we have a very thin line of private freedom. So the other alternative to that is the awareness and encouraging, possibly even incentivizing people to proportionally give a certain section of a garden. We have experienced this in my past when we worked with volunteers. We would do things in people's gardens. We would give them trees and plant them for them and maintain them for them, and they would see the benefits after a couple of years. And we would get a whole row of trees in a street that has no trees on the street, but they're all in the front gardens on the street. So it's a similar type of thing, and we got a lot of positive signs. And in public spaces, we could be planting trees that are attractive to people, that would incentivize them, like fruit trees, to use them in their own gardens. So when we show people and we ask people to help, most people will respond if they can, and then we have to encourage it in some other way, whether it's an incentive or some form of physical intervention that we are allowed to do something. But yet it is difficult in private gardens to make any sort of pleas other than voluntary work.
Okay, I agree, and our preliminary data indicates a very important role of private gardens in terms of providing these benefits that we mentioned, in terms of noise pollution reduction, in terms of improvement of air quality. So in terms of urban cooling and local climate regulation. And I agree that sometimes we don't consider these benefits because these are possibly small spaces, especially in a highly dense environment like the urban area in Malta. But the benefits are there when you actually calculate things together. And then there's another aspect as well. It's the interaction with the environment. There are studies, for example, showing that even small scale plots like allotment gardens, for example, but also small scale plots where there's some form of agriculture, crop cultivation going on, some form of kitchen gardens. This also increases biodiversity. So there are benefits to the people in terms of recreation, but also benefits to biodiversity in general. I'm not sure if anyone wants to add anything else. We can move on to the next question by Marzio. Thanks for your answers. Really glad for this meeting webinar. So what do you think about this? Is it better to continue the process of raising awareness among people and gather data with pilot projects and scattered examples in the EU and the European Union, or to try to enforce the use of nature-based solutions through national policies and promote incentives as it has been done for the solar panels? I think I can say a few words about the solar panels. I'm not an energy expert, but what has happened over the past few years here in Malta is that, well, I think if you go 10 years ago, not a lot of people had solar panels, but then because of schemes, and this is also what Marcus was saying just minutes ago, nowadays this become a regular feature in our urban areas and in the built environment. So this through incentives, through subsidies, more people have taken up the initiative of having solar panels and solar water heaters and so on. I think both are important, and we're just mentioning the importance of private gardens. And I think their education plays a very important role, but also potentially incentives to keep these small but important spaces, in especially private space, because a roof is also a private space, and at the end of the day, a green roof, and that's why you put a green roof. But I think we also need to consider the important role of larger spaces. So having pilot projects in a city, in municipalities, a central square where people walk to every day to catch a bus, to go to work and so on, is very important. And now it's also time, I think, to ride the wave of this COVID pandemic, where people where people were possibly using less cars, so they have become accustomed to using more the bikes. And I think that it's an opportunity to do both of these. People have been spending more time in their homes, so maybe they lack the interaction with nature. So that there you can incentivize education and awareness raising. And on the other hand, it's an opportunity also to try to increase the use of MBS in larger spaces, in public spaces. But I'm not sure what the audience think about it. I think Davide, for example, who has been measuring these sort of things in
Yeah, I
different
would like to
cities.
comment. I don't have a clear-cut answer about the question whether we should go for pilot projects or for incentives. But I could say that in the case of solar panels, the solution is kind of standard. So it's basically the same thing that can be applied pretty much in the same way everywhere. Whereas NBS need to be much more place specific. So the risk is that incentive will create kind of a homogeneous approach to replicating the same nature-based solutions that will get you the incentive, as opposed to try to co-design something that is place specific. So that's the risk or the difficulty that I see in promoting incentives. In that respect, pilot projects could be more interesting in showing the diversity and all those co-benefits that Marcus has very well illustrated before. But I do believe that there is still room for some sort of incentives on private
So,
gardens,
so,
for example.
so it's about design, David. That's what you're saying. It's
Yeah,
about design.
the,
The type of MBS is
the
important.
solar panels do not require design, basically,
Yeah.
except for very limited technical details, whereas NBS do require design. So if you want to set up an incentive schemes, it will be quite hard to do it in a way that can capture all the design elements and possibly making those elements place specific.
Marcus?
I fully agree. Sorry, Miriam. I fully agree. Having an incentive it only goes to a certain level. Maybe there are certain other types of incentives, such as a tax relief on renovations for people's houses, and you get a certain percentage of your tax relieved if you restore culturally, for example, windows and doors, and you can add another type of restoration in there, restoring a living structure, and this will incentivize businesses in that locality to be specific to that. So it could stimulate a type of industry, but it does also run the risk of being homogenized, the same company just using economy of scale and doing the same thing in every single house, and then you end up with sedum roofs everywhere like we did in the first place. And that's not a bad thing. They do work, and they do support a certain number. Bees do like the flowers, but they're not there all the time. So the substrate is supportive, etc. There's a certain level, but we've moved to the next generation of nature-based solutions, where we're trying to have diversity, not just biodiversity, but physical diversity as well, to incentivize a much greater community of wildlife in our cities and in our city regions. So incentives work a certain amount, but they only will work if you also have a way that demonstrates to people that these things work. Don't be afraid of it. People are afraid. I know a lot of people are afraid of gardening. They might do something wrong. I might break the plant, or I might kill the plant. I know I hear this all the time. I don't have plants because I kill them. And they need to be told that death is part of life, and that's how life goes. And then you just accept that. And here's how we work in our garden. Your new living structure, here's a set of instructions, but allow it to grow and so on. So people it needs to be demystified made less scary to people. And once that happens, they had to demystify solar panels. People were afraid that it would, they'd overheat or they'd burn like windmills. So once people understand the system and become familiar with the system, and we become familiar with speaking about the system, then I think it'll become it'll go very much faster, and then we will get that diversity, I hope.
Miriam?
One thing I just wanted to add on the issue of whether NBS should be part of policy directions or rather piecemeal pilot projects and incentives. Definitely to push nature-based solutions forward, they do need to be part of policy, but I think one key constraint at the moment from policymakers' perspectives is they feel that the evidence base just isn't quite there yet, especially in terms of the particular context. And so it's a little bit of a vicious circle, and that's where the pilot projects come in. So my perspective would be that in order for implementation into the policy level, we need to have pilot projects coming up first of all. And then I think the policy will follow, and then there'll be a cascade.
Okay. Again, I think that answers Marcio's question. We have more question from George, and George is asking if we are aware of any specific work on the use of green infrastructure in coastal areas, especially to address the issues of coastal erosion, and there may be some opportunities for collaboration. So this applies to all attendees, and I urge to get in touch with George if you're working in this sector. So I don't know if this is something where we can say a few words about this. I think there's opportunities for NBS implementation in different environments, including the coastal area, and there are some very nice examples for coastal erosion. But I leave it to the panel or also to the audience if you would like to say a few words about this.
I don't know a lot about it, but I'm from Scotland, and actually from my hometown, there is a problem with coastal erosion, and dunes are being turned to as a way of stabilizing that. So stabilizing the dune ecosystem through replanting and protecting the dunes is a way to halt coastal erosion.
Yeah.
It's happening a lot. In the Netherlands, it's creating artificial sand dunes, pumping sand at great environmental cost, I would say, from the deep ocean into building up sandbars to protect as soft defenses. And of course, we know that after Hurricane Katrina, the focus on mangrove restoration as a form of nature-based solution, as we would call it, ecological engineering, became very much funded in places like the United States and the Caribbean. So there are some very big examples of where nature is the only way to protect coastal property and lives and so on, where hard defenses, walls, usually have difficulty in terms of they cause problems elsewhere down the coastal area. Dune conservation is and dune restoration is and it usually involves transplanting marram grass and other types of grasses. Is usually the main form of coastal protection. But there are other potential ways of doing it as well in terms of trying to trap the sand artificially. I used to use trees, dead branches to catch sand and then plant on top of them and build up the dunes. So.
Another approach which is maybe better suited to places like Malta, which don't have much of a natural dune ecosystem, as far as I'm aware, is artificial reefs.
Yeah.
Those have a strong protective effect.
I think there's a few examples of that already being, which have been implemented in the past. We just didn't call them nature-based solutions. And also some, for example, so artificial reefs are one of them, and also this is not exactly my area of expertise, but for example, embankments to protect certain beaches or certain wetlands, and my colleagues from Malta would know a few examples about this, because And in some cases, we've measured that some of the coastal erosion has been reduced, or the erosion is happening for that embankment rather than the wetland, for example. And there are studies about this. Okay.
Mario?
Yes,
it's a question, just a curiosity. But do you have Posidonia in Malta? Also,
yes,
Posidonia
yes.
can act as a protection, no?
Yes, the Posidonia meadows are present and protected, and they themselves protect the coastal area and prevent coastal erosion. It's quite widespread and well protected with binational legislation, actually. Okay, I'm not sure if we have more questions. Let me check. Okay. Okay, George is mentioned that there are a number of problems with erosion, particularly for sandy beaches. Okay, and challenging situations where there are safety issues in rocky coastal areas. Okay, thank you, George. I'm not sure if there are any more questions. I think if not, we can bring this webinar to an end. And I would like to thank you all. I remind you about our forthcoming ReNature training course 5. It will be a pleasure to have you again with us. This will be in between the 14th and 16th September, spread over 3 days. And we'll be having a wider range of speakers. The objective today was to present some of our work in ReNature to our colleagues working in different sectors and countries. So I think that's it for today. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon in another ReNature activity or in other nature-based solutions activities. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thanks a lot.
Mario.
Take care, everybody.
Thank
Thank you for
you.
joining. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.